think I get started, as we've got a fair amount to go through, although we're a rather exclusive group at the moment. Um, but I suspect people will drift in eventually. More formally, welcome to the SOSSEN webinar on responding to the white paper consultation. Just in terms of how this is running, I have some slides here for background stuff, suggestions, etc. I'm intending this to be reasonably informal. There is a Q&A sort of facility, so if anyone wants to put questions on there, do put them in. The slides, I think, will be available afterwards. And as I say, we'll see how this goes in terms of time. But I was thinking about sort of stopping part way through to talk about any specific questions that people have. I've prepared some slides with some thoughts on some of the questions in the webinar. I do want to emphasize that this is not us dictating what you have to put, because it is really important that it should be your views. But it's just sort of some thoughts, our views, some sort of prompts in a way to what you might like to think about in terms of some of the questions. So just moving on to the consultation at first itself, this slide, the first one, gives you some links to the main documents. If you hit the first link, it gives you a list of a number of versions of the consultation document, including there's an easy read one, there's a British Sign Language one, and some other information like their equality impact report and details of the specialist provision packages, which are quite a feature of the proposals. And the Department for Education they keep telling us they want to hear from us, and they're actually holding some sort of in-person and online consultation events. And the second link on that slide shows you how you can book in for those. In terms of finding the questions, in some ways it's a little bit of a mystery too. They do, first of all, appear under the particular section that they relate to. So if you've got to select a section that's about funding, then the questions on funding are underneath that. So it does direct you to that section, and it's worth reading that section certainly before you answer the question, so that you know basically what it is they're talking about and asking about. And then towards the end, there's a number of appendices. And on page 120, if you go to the print version, that's the one that's got the page numbers on. Page 120 has the full list of questions. And there's an appendix which explains the consultation process, and then appendix C is giving more of a summary of all the questions. And it starts off with, as you would expect, some personal questions about you and what's the capacity that you're responding in, and are you responding on behalf of an organisation, etc. And it says that you can ask for your name or your organisation to be kept confidential, but they want you to explain why. And that's because normally at the end of this process, they do publish a list of everyone who's responded to the consultation. Whether they are specifically going to do that in this case, I don't know. It is, I would hope, going to be thousands of people, so an individual's name isn't going to be that prominent, but it will be published. However, there's no specific link that I can find on the consultation document to the actual online consultation or information about how you answer. And there are, hence I've put the links in on this page. So there's an online consultation where they line up all the questions with text boxes. And that is, in many ways, the easy way of answering. You'll just fill in those text boxes and then ultimately sends it off and it's gone. The possible disadvantage is that those boxes only allow for a limited number of characters, but I think it's, on the whole, it's reasonably generous. My one concern would be that when you come to the final question, which is a sort of roundup, is there anything else you want to tell us? That is not going to be enough. If you are concerned about whether you'll have enough space, you can do it separately. You can send it all by email, and you've got the email address there, and I would put that onto a separate piece of paper with each question as a heading and put it in. But what I would say is resist the temptation to write great long essays, because they are, I hope, again, going to give thousands of responses to this. They're not going to read long essays. In fact, they have said they're going to use AI to analyze to an extent. And the usual advice is that if you want your thoughts to filter through AI, to keep your sentences quite short and punchy. And they're going to be looking for themes. People saying, we don't like this, we disagree with that, we strongly disagree with the other. That's the sort of theme there. I think they are probably aiming to pick up. I mean, there will be some things that they will look at more closely, like sort of, I think, responses from local authorities and schools and things. But other stuff, they will come through AI. There's also a postal address if you want to do it that way. And the deadline is the 18th of May. And one question people are asking is really, is it worth doing this at all? Are they going to pay any attention to me? I would say yes. I mean, I suppose in a way we would, but for what it's worth, I've been around long enough to remember when we did this 12 years ago, or 14 years ago in practice, working up to the current law. And there were quite major differences between the original proposals and what actually came out of the whole process at the end. So these things certainly are capable of being changed. Department for Education keeps saying they want to hear from people, and especially from people like parents, carers, children and young people. And if you don't reply, they are going to say, oh, well, people haven't replied because they're so happy with it all. And if you're not happy, then that's not the impression you want to give. It does sound quite daunting. I mean, there's 39 questions, and some of them you will look at and you will think, I know nothing at all about that, and I probably don't care. In which case, don't answer it. You don't have to. Or if it won't let you get to the next page, put a dot in or something. But as I say, you don't have to answer every question at all. You can concentrate on what you want. However, as I will do want to emphasize, there are a number of things that are quite important that they have not answered questions on. And I would say, please be quite robust about these things. And if you look at it and you think, well, I've read through that section, I have nothing to say in answer to that question, or very little to say in answer to that specific question, but there's an awful lot about that section I want to make comments on, then go ahead and do it. Say to them, this is the question you should have answered. Because I think it's really important that they should hear views. And again, they're claiming they want to hear. And I will admit to having a bias here, but the Department for Education are pushing the agenda that parents like the proposals. You might have seen something to the effect of MPs being told that was what they wanted to have reported back to them after their meetings with parents. And if it's the situation that you don't like some of the proposals or a few of them, whatever, they need to hear about it. And it will make it much more difficult for them to ignore things if a lot of parents are, and indeed teachers and others are telling them they do not like proposals. One little point, as you might have heard, there's a legal challenge ongoing about the consultation, and you might be wondering what that's about and does it affect whether you should deal with this. What it is really that issue I mentioned just now, that there are some very important proposals with big effects where they don't ask any question whatsoever. and it is a sort of parent leading the proposal on behalf of her child, and she's sort of done her solicitors have done a pre-action letter where they raised this. And initially, they got a response from the Department for Education lawyers saying, well, yeah, we haven't asked those questions because we're not interested in the answers because we've already made a decision. It wasn't quite as blunt as that. But not surprisingly, that created quite a fuss. Whereupon there was a quick U-turn, and the minister said, "Oh, no, 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 no! We didn't mean that. We're terribly interested in everything, and you can put your answers in to anything that you think you haven't been asked in response to question 39, which is a sort of the final catch-all question. And as Peter pointed out, that's really not satisfactory because if you look at the instructions for question 39, it's more or less saying there's some things we deliberately haven't asked you questions about because we've made a decision. I mean, again, not in quite those words, but more or less it. So it's sort of heading you off on if you've got anything new to say. And they wanting us to sort of ignore that now, apparently. Um, and it's a limited size text box if you use the online thing. So if you're going to use that for everything they've left out, you won't have much space. And by the time they made that U-turn, a number of people had answered already. So they haven't got a second chance to go back and answer and deal with those issues. So the judicial review is going ahead, and who knows what will happen. It might be that they'll be told to redo the consultation or to do another consultation asking specifically those questions, or they might get chucked out. Um, but I would say that basically don't wait for the outcome of that consultation. I would suggest you go ahead anyway and answer it, but keep your eyes open to see if that makes if the court case does make a difference and if there's a further consultation or anything like that. Um, there are a lot of people like us who are sort of posting, are doing things to try to help people. And some people are suggesting the answers, or they've actually published the answers they have given, etc. And some people have said, well, am I best off just cutting and pasting those? In fact, I'm not sure if they are, but I think in the past we've had times when people have said, well, let's run a campaign where everybody puts the same answers in. And I would suggest don't do that because they've got AI, they'll pick these things up and they'll basically throw those away. If it looks like it's not genuinely somebody's opinion, it's a sort of orchestrated response, they won't pay any attention to it. I mean, obviously, there's nothing wrong with looking at the suggestions, see, do you agree to it? Is that, does that give rise to it? But if you're going to use similar responses, please try and put it in your own wording. People have also asked about using AI for responses. Of course you can. Um, but again, I would suggest don't ask AI to tell you what the answer should be because you'll get nonsense out of it, really. I'm no expert on AI, but this sort of suggestion is that you do a sort of a rough draft of your thoughts, paste it in, or put in any particular links that you want it to reference, like say an article that you agree with, and say, well, would you just reword this for me? But do bear in mind if you're using a free sort of AI thing, they do have a daily limit, so there's a limit to how much you can put in. There's a great article on special needs jungle about the same topic, and they've got a lot of information about AI on that, including quite a useful basic prompt sort of instructions to AI to make sure that it's to improve your chances of getting a good result out of it. So it's worth having a look at that. Um, yeah. So, sort of thoughts about how you should approach this. And you've probably got your own ideas, but it would suggest that the first thing you do is read through the consultation document. Warning, however, it's a long document, so it's over 100 pages, and there's an awful lot of repetition. So when you find yourself reading familiar bits, I would frankly give myself permission to skim. Um, there is also the easy read version, and that's probably quite a good starting point, actually, simply as a summary in the, but when you go through it, you might like to arm yourself with a highlighter and a pen, just as again, so you can find the important bits again, and maybe scribble notes in the margin. My copy's full of rude notes. And then sort of think about it. How is this going to affect your child? If you're in a school, how's it going to affect your school? Um, what if your child is, if you're sort of thinking, oh, good, because none of this is going to come into force before 2030, it won't affect me. Nevertheless, think about, suppose it was in force now, how would it affect your child? How would it have affected your child if this had been the law whenever it was you were applying for an HCP, or just generally worrying about things? Um, and be reasonably critical about it. I'm not saying you have to pick holes, but sometimes, you get promises that sound great, but think about how realistic it is that it's going to happen, especially funding. There's a lot of big figures in here, but you have to think about that in terms of those sums being shared amongst schools or teachers, all through the country. Is it going to be enough? And there are people who have crunched the numbers, and sometimes when has that happened? I've given you details of what I've seen as to how this translates realistically. And with funding, generally speaking, they're talking in terms of it being in place for 3 years. So think about, well, what happens after 3 years? What happens if we have a change of government? This is the law that may be in place. Are they necessarily going to put this funding into keeping it going? Particularly if it's quite a radical change of government. Um, and generally, is this better or worse than what we've got now? And think you can, or by all means, be constructive. What would help any proposal to work, and what might not? Um, if a lot of this is actually things that you don't have to change the law for, to be honest. It is things like more training for teachers, could have been done years ago. Uh, so there is a valid question about why these things don't happen already, and whether we actually do need to change the law to achieve these sort of improvements. You obviously certainly read around things. There's our website, IPSI's got stuff, Special Needs Jungle, Save Our Children's Rights, an organisation that's campaigning about these reforms. There is a webinar which Special Needs Jungle, um, uh, full disclosure, I was on it, so that's sort of why I know about it. But that's quite a useful one in terms of a summary of things that were worrying various legal bods at the time that you might like to look at. But there is a lot around. Have a good look, but just make sure that what you're looking at is reasonably reliable. Having read it all, then go back to the questions. And again, give the questions a bit of time, a bit of thinking. And I would suggest you make some rough notes, maybe typing them, and then go back and tidy them up, and then just paste the answers into the box or into your email document if that's what you're using. You can always use the dictation app if you're comfortable with it. As I was saying earlier, suggest, generally speaking, try and keep answers and sentences fairly short. One thing which I'm assuming it's mostly parents on here, and it's where your responses are gold dust, is the fact that you are able to give real life examples. This is how things were for my child. This is how your proposal would not work for my child. Or this is how your proposal would be improved if it was my child. However, do bear in mind again, they're not going to read these things with a view to looking for a specific complaint. So they're not going to pick anything up and say, goodness, that sounds bad, I've got to investigate that. And if it does look as if you're only pursuing some personal issue, they are going to ignore it. Suggest, for common sense, don't put anything that specifically identifies you or your child in. But don't assume that anyone who's reading this actually knows anything about the SEND system. Sometimes it's easy to assume that they do, but don't necessarily. So don't start saying, oh, well, our local PTOI said this, because people won't know what PTOI means in anywhere else, that type of thing. So sort of think about the fact that you are, in many respects, you're talking to a machine, or you're talking to civil servants who don't really know the ins and outs of things. Just have a quick look whether we have any questions or anything. Not sure that we do. Not yet. That's fine. Okay. I'll come back to that. If you want to put any questions up, then by all means do. If you could put it into the Q&A, that's the easiest thing. So I've started just cherry picking a few questions, not going through all of them because it would take forever, and that's not really particularly helpful. So it's a little bit subjective in terms of things that either interest me or us as an organisation, or we think people can particularly contribute to in terms of answering. And this is sort of roughly, these questions roughly go through the consultation in the order of the points where they've explained their proposals. And it starts off with proposals for the whole system, that there's going to be a universal offer that's going to set a new baseline for mainstream education. The idea being that you're going to raise standards generally, and in particular, they're going to promote inclusion for children with SEN. You may be aware there's quite a lot of emphasis on the fact that most children with SEND should be able to be educated in the mainstream. And so there's all sorts of fairly high-flying, ambitious things that they are saying they will aim to be achieved, like having ambitious leadership in the schools, high-quality teaching, curriculum designed for all learners, inclusive environments, etc., etc. They will be putting in training for teachers and teaching assistants and everybody else to meet all of those. And each school is going to have to develop an inclusion strategy through which they plan support, and they aim particularly to make sure that they are including children with SEND. And there will be £1.6 billion put into a mainstream fund. So the question is, how can we ensure that children are best supported by the universal offer, which is quite a difficult one to answer, but have a think about it, particularly the whole issue about inclusion. Would it help your child? Is it the right way to go? How can a universal offer help to make inclusion work? What will need to change to make it work? If you think the whole model should be changed, or you simply disagree with a universal offer and the inclusion strategy being the way to go, then say so. But you could think really quite widely about this. For example, I've seen a suggestion that for inclusion to work, actually, you have to get rid of the massive, great comprehensive schools and have a number of smaller schools, because that way it's more control of what goes on. It's more sort of nurturing environment. It's quieter, etc. Whatever you think might be helpful, especially for your child. It then goes on to say that there's going to be support in layers, which apart from the universal offer, which is for everybody, there will basically be 3 layers above that, which is targeted plus, and specialist, and they'll be quite flexible. The idea is that children will move between them. When you see CYP, that's children and young people. Um, so you might go up and down, and basically targeted support will be from the school and from the school's normal resources. Targeted Plus would get support from the school, but they would be calling in some outside input from, say, educational psychologists and health professionals. And children on Targeted Plus might have access to a support base within the school. And there's another section about those. If your child qualifies for specialist support, they will qualify. They will qualify for an EHCP. But for all three levels, including the EHCP, the day-to-day support, what happens in school every day, will come via an individual support plan. And it's going to be the school's responsibility to draw that up, and they will have the statutory duty to deliver the support, which is different from their duties now, where they have a duty to use best endeavours to meet needs. So in theory, at least, it's a stronger responsibility being put on schools, although, as you'll see, there's a question mark about is it actually enforceable. So the benefit of this, set out in the white paper, is that it's flexible. The support plans will be digital, so you can change them quite easily and quickly. You can move people between the levels without having to go through a whole massive complicated assessment process and consultation and so on, as you do now to get an EHCP. However, the downside of that, I would suggest, is that although it's quicker, if you don't have an assessment process, how do you know that you're going that you've actually identified all the child's needs? We find quite regularly that things get missed. Some schools are completely unaware of the fact that neurodivergent children mask, for instance. They may be completely unaware of sensory issues. So, that child who's really sensitive to sound and constantly got their hands over their ears, they're actually in pain, and that's making it difficult for them to concentrate. And we quite regularly find things that now where when a child is assessed, brings up information which is completely new to the school. So I would just worry about going on to these without having an assessment, because you might be putting money into the wrong type of support. I mean, the obvious thing would be, say, give them a bit of time with a teaching assistant. But if what they actually need is a bit of speech and language therapy, then that money's going to be wasted. It's certainly going to put an awful lot of work on schools. These schools are going to have to draw up these ISPs. They will, to be fair, be able to call in some support from outside experts, and the idea is one proposal is to make that a bit more accessible. But then they're the ones who are going to have to orchestrate that. It's not the local authority's job to get those reports. They will have to think about which level the child should be on. Should they be in a support group? And what sort of provision they should have. It'll be their responsibility to make sure that all the provision in an ISP is being delivered. It'll have to be reviewed at least once a year. So that's a lot of work to be done. And I know schools and teaching unions are very concerned about it. To have a think about whether that's desirable, what would be needed to make it work. I mean, I would suggest fairly obviously quite a lot more money for more staffing, and to give people like Senko's much more time. But there may be other things. And they keep telling us that schools will be fully accountable because they will have a statutory duty. And I'll talk about it a bit more later, but the proposal is that either problems will be picked up by Ofsted or something similar, or you will have to use the school complaints process, and that's all. Question, is that actually going to be realistically a good way to enforce things? Is it desirable? It's going to start putting parents at war with schools if you have to keep going through the complaints process. And are the governors and so on who run the complaints processes really fitted to decide what should be in an ISP? The next question is, how do we ensure that children in the specialist layer are best supported? And this is a complicated proposal. What they're saying is that children on this layer will get support through a specialist provision package. And there will be 7 of these, they are suggesting. They'll be designed by experts. They're still working on them. There is a separate document, which is linked to later in a later slide, which sets out what will be in the packages. But they're different categories according to, physical needs, sensory needs, learning difficulties, mental health needs, things like that. And the white paper reads as if your child has to fit into one of those packages. But to be fair, the minister has subsequently said that no, that's not necessarily the case. There might be a degree of cherry picking, but that's going to be complicated. And I wonder, therefore, what's the benefit of the package if it does cover everything? And once you have a specialist provision and a specialist provision package, that qualifies the child for an EHCP, and delivery of what's in the package will be the responsibility of the LA. But all that's going to happen really is that there'll be an outline of that package in the EHCP. The actual nitty-gritty, the detailed and quantified support that is now in section F, won't be in an EHCP it will be in the ISP, and it will be the local authority responsibility, the school's responsibility to deliver it. So you can still contrast that with the current system. Each and every need of each individual child is supposed to be identified and described in section B, and then each of those is supposed to have specified and defined support in section F. I know it doesn't necessarily happen, but that's because local authorities don't obey the law. And then the placement that's named in section I has to be capable of delivering everything in F. And it's the local authority that's got a statutory duty to make sure it's all in place. If necessary, you can start judicial review action against the local authority or complaints process to enforce that. So it slightly mystifies me because the minister keeps talking about not having one size fits all, and yet this is sort of 7 sizes fits all. And we are moving away from something which is individualized to each child to a much more generic package. So have a think about, they're saying, how do we ensure that children on this layer are best supported? It may be worth saying, well, actually, the question is whether this model is the way to go at all, or whether you would, or if you think actually they would be best supported if they didn't have a package, but they had their needs individually identified and provision for them, enforceable provision for them set out in and specified in an EHCP. Say what you think about that. Question. Yes, this is about something that they call areas of development, which they say they have refreshed. And very quickly on this, in the current EHCP, you'll generally see needs and to extent provision grouped under 4 categories, which are cognition and learning, communication and interaction, social, emotional, mental health, and sensory and physical. And instead, they are saying we will have these 5 categories. And I won't read through it all because it's boring, but it's basically executive function, speech, language, and communication, motor and physical, sensory, social, and emotional. Have a read through those and think, are you happy with it? Does it cover everything? Would it cover everything in terms of your child? Notably, it doesn't really refer to learning as such or things like literacy and numeracy. Personally, I'm quite pleased they've got a separate section for sensory because it's the one that tends to get forgotten about. But there's nothing, what used to be mental, just social and emotional. And mental health is a big problem, increasing problem. There is a suggestion in the proposal that they would be considering getting mental health input in SPPs. Why not have that specifically identified? I'm a little bit concerned that it looks as if they would like to fob it off onto health and say it's not really education. And it clearly is, because a child who's too anxious to be in school is not learning. So have a think about that one. This is one again, maybe if there's any teachers here, we'll have much more ideas about this, but you're dealing with teachers, so you might have thoughts about it. Practical actions to help teachers, teaching assistants, therapists, etc., manage their workload whilst implementing the changes. And specifically, it refers to the fact they put in place a training package of £200 million funding spread over 3 years for all staff, right through from sort of nursery through to college, and also reviewing the role of the SENCO. And that's one of the ones where people have crunched the numbers and said that's going to cover around half a day's training for each staff member involved. Is that going to be enough? Because the second point is the fact that there's going to be so much more of a workload in the mainstream. And as I was saying before, perhaps think about outside the box a bit more about what would actually help. Because if this does go through, anything that does help schools to deliver can only be in everyone's benefit. 18 and 19, yeah, this is about the support basis, inclusion basis. They're saying, how can we make sure every need area can meet the full range of needs of children, young people through inclusion bases, and that the bases help them to succeed in mainstream settings. So what the proposal is that every mainstream setting, or virtually every mainstream setting, will have these separate bases. A lot of them have them now. They can be called units or resource bases or things like that. And basically, they'll change the names. There'll be support bases, which are lower level, funded by the school, and they will be more or less for children at the targeted level. And there will be specialist bases, which are funded by local authorities, and they will be providing particularly for children with EHCPs and children on Targeted Plus. And over time, it's expected that every secondary school will have one of these. There'll be an equivalent number of places in primary schools. They're not going to say every school must have one, because you have to think about the ones on sort of the remote islands and things who are clearly not going to. So again, there's a few suggestions down there about what you might want to think about. I mean, they'd say they want these bases to meet the full range of needs. So that's every type of special educational needs. Autism, dyslexia, Down syndrome, hearing problems, you name it. Is that realistic? I would suggest it clearly cannot be for the most complex needs. And maybe that's not what they mean, but they haven't quite said that. But given that this is all in the context of inclusion, and they want to be able to say these are children who are being included in the mainstream, will it actually be inclusive? If you've had a child in a unit like this, have you found that's inclusive? I mean, they tend to have different models according, some will be partly in class, some in the base, some of the children will spend all their time in the base. Is that actually inclusive? Will they, if the dyslexia support base is in a school 20 miles away, is that inclusive in terms of your child having to not living anywhere near any of their friends and so on? What sort of staffing would they need? One of the proposals, the advantages of this is said to be that you'll have expert staff in these things, to sort of spread their expertise and be available to other staff in the school. Great, but is that going to be realistic if they are taking quite a hefty burden of pupils who might otherwise be in a specialist school? Yeah, experts at hand. This I mentioned briefly earlier. It's a proposal that they're actually starting to put this investment in place, to be fair, to improve access to professionals for all schools and colleges and everything else. And the plan is that by April 2029, primary schools should be able to access, on average, 40 days a year expert support from a number of types of expert, like educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, etc., and 160 days for secondary and something or other for college and early years settings. We don't quite know what. And they are saying particularly they are particularly funding putting money aside to train psychologists, speech and language therapists. But the idea is not really that these people will be working individually with children. It's more that they'll provide training and group-based approaches, and they'll advise on strategies and interventions and so on. In fact, if they were providing individual support, if you think about it, for children with a lot of needs, and if that's covering educational psychologists, speech therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, etc., you will soon use up your 40 days a year in primary schools. So they won't really be able to use them that much for individual support. It is suggested this would be supplemented because sometimes mainstream schools there may be a system whereby children could be transferred into a specialist setting for a short space of time and then come back. Would that work? It seems to me that's quite disruptive. I'm not sure how much specialist schools would welcome it. You will probably be aware that there's currently a big shortage of educational psychologists and speech therapists. They've sort of addressed that by this plan to put in funding for training, also trying to recruit from things like people who've gone into private practice or who've retired, or use support workers and trainees. And I would worry that last one is going to dilute this a bit. So, I mean, they're only talking about funding for those two. And actually, there was an article which I haven't read fully, but it came out in Special News Jungle yesterday or today, where someone has crunched the numbers on this £1.8 billion and how far that's going to go. And they're saying that really this is not going to be enough to address the current shortages, let alone to increase. So that is one thing that really does need to be dealt with. And you might want to think about that issue I mentioned about not having having a requirement for assessment before a child goes on to an ISP, or maybe having a requirement that certain assessments must be carried out as part of the EHCP process. At the moment, it's not the current law. It only says you must get an educational psychology report, but I always think that it ought to be mandatory that they get speech and language and occupational therapy reports for children with autism, for instance. So that sort of thing could be quite useful. If they were prepared to mandate these assessments happen, that I would suggest would improve things, but they will have to put a lot of investment in. Specialist provision packages, there's the link there to what they are. Some of this I've talked about before. They'll draw these up after statutory assessment led by local authorities. People could have one of these either in a special school or mainstream, but they will only be outlined in the package. It won't be detailed. The day-to-day detail will still be through ISPs. And I'm sort of there's a question along similar lines to the previous ones, but how do we make sure these support children best? But again, I would go back and perhaps be critical about it and think, is this actually the best way to go, or would it be better not to have these packages, but to have individualized support? There is a slightly odd-sounding question, number 21, about children with low incidence complex needs, by which they mean rare needs, really. because they won't fit easily into a package, and they won't be drawing up packages for those. And that's some of the very rare genetic illnesses, some conditions like sort of epilepsy, where currently there are very specialist and expensive schools and so on, and some other sort of very specific issues like that. Uh, and they're saying, well, how do you think they could access the right specialist placement? And I would frankly say it's an easy answer. Give them an individualized assessment and specify what their provision should be, but it's up to you. And they also ask about the design. And again, I would say, is this the way to go? What concerns me in a way is it's slightly jobs for the boys. There's going to be all these lovely panels deciding on these expert packages for years to come. They will be expensive. They're not going to undercharge. And it's all going to be a bit theoretical, people in ivory towers dictating what should happen in schools. I mean, I may be wrong. I would hope they will recruit people with experience. But again, is this really the way to go? 23, how do they make their proposals work more effectively? That's the whole package of SPP plus ISP. And again, I would think about, is it workable at all? Or should we look at an improvement on what we have now by making things more, just making local authorities obey the law? One particular issue that I'm really quite concerned about is you won't have annual reviews for specialist provision packages as you have now, because they will only have reviews at the key stage transition points, like primary to secondary. That's really limited. I mean, currently an annual review is a useful tool. You can call an emergency annual review if things are going wrong or if the child's at risk of exclusion. And you can, it's a good opportunity to get together and say what's working, what isn't, and that will go. And also, of course, now an annual review carries a right to appeal effectively every year if you need it. That will go. Um, and the only way you can disagree with an ISP, the context of an ISP, is going to be through the school complaint system. At the moment, if you disagree with the contents of an EHCP, you go to the tribunal, which, okay, is a cumbersome, slow process, but there are things you can do to improve that. But at least it's an expert panel who know what they're doing, and they're paid to do it, and they can make orders that are enforceable, which school governors cannot. So might it be better just to keep what we've got now and just build in proper accountability to make it easier to make local authorities comply with the law? They're saying the next question is the needs assessment process. What do you expect to be conditioned? And what they're proposing is that you develop an EHCP with the schools. Basically, it's for the schools will have a lot of input in consultation with parents, but you only develop the EHCP after you've decided on which specialist provision package the child's in, and after you've decided on the placement decision, which is quite odd. Think about whether you really think that is the way to go, whether you want to object to that. Setting was going to have the legal duty to deliver what's on the offer and sort of ISP. Needs assessment will include input from experts who supported the child or both person to date. That again is quite worrying because what we have now is that they have to, the local authority is supposed to get reports from anyone they think is appropriate or anyone the parents reasonably request. And now they're saying no, only if you've been with that service before will they get the report. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. There will be a standardized EHC plan. Hooray. We've needed that. Reviews of ISPs every year. Fast track for under fives, which is a plus. So just some questions which you might think about that. Is it satisfactory? You can only get reports from people who've already been involved. It quite regularly happens that somebody like the school or an educational psychologist says, hey, I think this child has massive sensory problems. But there won't be any mechanism to get that assessed because they haven't been with an occupational therapy service before. I mean, it's fair to say that local authorities frequently now get the right reports. But again, what about making it mandatory that they should get reports? Because it's so hard to enforce that now. Should you make some assessments mandatory, as it says? Well, this is sort of what I was talking about earlier. Should we have more frequent annual reviews? Should we have a right to appeal for annual reviews, which has been taken away? Yes, this is an interesting one. The proposal is, when it comes to choosing a school, that the local authorities will provide a list of settings able to deliver the appropriate SPP, although parents can still ask for another school. They won't have to name a school where the placement would have a detrimental effect on pupils already in the setting, nor indeed if they say they are full. Currently, if a school says it's full, a local authority is still supposed to say, "Are you really?" Check that out. But they won't have to do that anymore. So schools will be able to basically say no just by giving one of those reasons. There will be an increased duty to take into account value for money and fairness. And in particular, local authorities might be required to consider whether making one really high cost placement is going to have an adverse effect on their ability to meet the needs of other children. So have a think about that. So they're saying, what factors should they take into account when proposing a list? Is it desirable to have those lists at all? Will it feel too restrictive? Would it be better if you could actually choose according to whether a school can meet individual needs rather than deliver a package? How far should they investigate? Are they really full? It's going to be a bit of a postcode lottery, this thing about considering whether your one placement is going to bust the budget. If you live in, say, Kensington, which has rather a healthy budget, you stand a much better chance of getting the expensive placement than if you live in, say, Birmingham, which is bankrupt. Surely that's the postcode lottery, which they say they want to avoid. I'll just do this very quickly. There's sort of proposals for limiting the costs of what local authorities have to pay in independent schools, saying that they will all effectively be on what is now the Section 41 list, which means that if they are named, they have to take the child. And they will have to follow the SPP packages. But there's silence about how limiting fees is going to work with things like residential schools or some of these incredibly specialist schools that have things like a mini hospital attached for things like children with epilepsy. Some of the really specialist schools do want to be able to say no because they are so specialist, and there's no point them taking a child that's outside their area of specialisation should they lose that right. Will it push independent schools out of the market, and will that mean there'll be fewer schools? I mean, in some respects, I agree that some special schools have ridiculously high fees, but are we perhaps throwing the baby out with the bathwater here? Proposal for everyone to sort of become parts of SEND groups and join trusts, basically to pool funding and so on. Is pooling funds a good idea at all, or just keeping on, or for the school keeping its own funds? Do you want your school to be part of a trust and a group, or would you rather that it just was, governed by its board of governors? This is one of the really controversial ones. In fact, this is one of the ones that the litigation is about. There's a long chapter about sort of appeals and accountability called Resolution and Legal Framework. And it's got a number of really important things in. And there's only one question asked. Should there be a SEND specialist on the complaints panel, which is just extraordinary. So what they say is that the complaints process will be strengthened a bit. And in particular, there would be a SEND specialist who might be somebody like a local SENCO or senior school leader on the panel who's independent of the school. You could still bring complaints through disability discrimination appeals. Ofsted will be keeping an eye on things because they can look at equality and they can look at complaints, and they will think about other suggestions for an independent scrutiny panel, like other parents and practitioner experts, to look at things like patterns and where one school is getting an unusually high number of complaints and so on. Possibly independent mediation, well, there will be for decisions about specialist schools. And all of that's rather controversial. Tribunal appeals would still be possible. Refusal to assess, refusal basically to issue and put the PP and therefore an EHCP, disagreement with the package, decision to cease to maintain, and disagreement with the setting. But if you disagree with the setting, all that the tribunal can do, if they agree with you, is to say, yeah, the local authority decision was unreasonable. They will not be able to name an alternative placement. It will just go back to the local authority to think again. The local authority could make the same decision. And in the meantime, presumably, potentially, your child has no school place. So they will be left in limbo. And that one is really controversial, not surprisingly, because that's taking away a very important right. And one response might be, is why are you only asking one question about this section? I mean, this thing at the bottom here is my personal rant as a governor about school complaint system being an adequate remedy. I don't think school governors actually want to do this. They are, if any of you are governors, you're really busy. They're not trained. They haven't come into school governance necessarily to deal with SEND. They come in because they're just interested or all sorts of reasons. They're not trained certainly in dealing with SEND. Um, uh, and they're already really busy. In my time as a governor, the response way up, and this is really almost doubling. That all the proposals really virtually double what they're going to have to do. I seriously question that they're going to have time or be willing to do this. I also question really whether parents would have faith in these panels being independent. At the moment, governors' panels deal with school exclusion decisions. They uphold them in 95% of cases. And I'm not sure, I'm sure there's a benefit to having a SEND specialist, but they will always be in the minority, presumably. And are they really going to be independent if it's from a local school? Because local schools talk to each other. And indeed, they're being encouraged to talk to each other in these proposals. If the complaints panel makes a decision, effectively the school could just ignore it. There's nothing very much that could happen. Maybe parents can bring judicial review, but there's big question marks around that. Are you sort of look at the appeals? It's not certainly answer whether you're happy about taking away the right for the name of school, but what about the fact that you can't appeal after an annual review? Things like that. I would really quite go to town on that one. And question 39 is just this final question. And there's a few suggestions here, which I have talked about on the whole as we go along, that you might want to put in. But there's also really noticeable omissions from this white paper. One of the ones that's alarming people most is it says nothing about children who are not in school. And if you combine this, there's a sort of a worry that being the emphasis on mainstream schools, combine it with the Wellbeing in Schools Act, which has, I think, gone through, is there going to be pressure for children to go back into school when it's harmful to them? Really nothing much about children over 16, occasional mentions of colleges, but not much more. Do you agree with the whole idea of taking so much responsibility away from local authorities and putting it onto schools, etc.? Have a good think about that. Losing annual reviews at all. Really think about how it would affect your child, as I say. And really, do we need such a radical change at all? Think about the effects on exclusions. At the moment, many more children who have SEND but don't have an EHCP get excluded. The aim is to have fewer EHCPs. It is pretty likely that that's going to mean that there will be more exclusion, so there will be more children out of school. I don't think that one's really been thought through by the DfE, but it is a concern. And finally, that's a little bit of campaigning. We're a member of the Save Our Children's Rights group. There's going to be a protest in London and other areas on May the 9th. There's a lot of publicity about it on Facebook and elsewhere. do join us. Come and wave a banner. Let people know what you think if you want to protest. Um, I'll just sort of come out of this and have a look at questions. Slightly over time, but do join in and have a chat or a rant or anything. Great, this really helpful to have some questions to go about. Yeah, question they asked. Yeah, Noreen said if a child has EOTAS and is therefore not linked with the school, how would the provision be delivered? This is the big question. It's really silent on this. The whole thing is dependent on ISP being drawn up. Who draws up that ISP? Ideally, it needs to be someone who knows the child and is very familiar with their difficulties, but also knows a reasonable amount about strategies and things to meet different types of needs. I suspect there is some sort of thinking along the lines that children will be on school rolls, but do people want that to happen? Are you going to have faith in teachers who don't really know your child drawing up these ISPs? Alternatively, should it be tutors who are working with the child? I mean, logically, I would suggest yes, it should, but can you start imposing statutory obligations on private tutors, individuals? Um, we do not know. I mean, when asked this question, all the minister ever says is nothing will change, which is not helpful, frankly, unless she is saying that actually we will have detailed and specific provision in an EHCP. It will be the local authority responsibility to ensure that it happens. If that's so, yeah, we would be happy, but I'm not sure about that. And another very pertinent question, is there a conflict of interest if the school governor is reviewing complaints? Well, yeah, I mean, this is my concern equally, even though I'm a governor. If you're a governor, they're different people. Some of them, one or two parent governors, teacher governors. There's people who are sort of community governors who are not directly concerned with the school. But nevertheless, you are working with them quite a lot. You will go into, you'll probably have one area of responsibility and go in to have meetings with a teacher that's responsible for that area. Like in my case, surprise, surprise, it's SEND. But for others, it might be the maths curriculum um, or English or art or something. And you're meeting the head and the deputy regularly and so on. You probably have a fairly friendly relationship with them. And also you're sort of looking over your heads at the fact that there's Ofsted, and you don't want Ofsted to start making adverse findings about the school because it potentially reflects on the governors. Um, so yeah, I would worry about it. They may have the best of intentions, but even subconsciously, they don't really want to find against the school and get into a fight with the school. Um, so, and we have that statistic that there are school governors panels who make the first decisions after a temporary or a permanent school exclusion. 95% of those end up with upholding the decision. So that does indicate that's a big imbalance, because in the case of a permanent exclusion, you can then take it onto an independent panel. And there's quite a number of those do end up with overturning the decisions. So it's not as if we can say, oh, well, they're only upholding the schools because schools always get it right, because the independent panels are finding that no, they don't necessarily. So it's a concern. And if that worries you, then please put that in your response to the consultation. And somebody else rightly makes the point also, is this conflict issue. I mean, I know heads now say they hate it dealing with complaints because it takes a lot of their time. And there's this fact that there's this parent who is not happy, and that's not something that's going to make you happy as a head teacher. And if you then got to go and explain yourself to that parent in front of a panel of governors, it's not great. If the parent is really unhappy about it and doesn't agree with the outcome, theoretically they might go take it further. They may go through a disability discrimination complaint, or they might possibly be able to go through judicial review. And that's war, really. For a school to get an adverse discrimination finding against them is bad news. And so they will tend to oppose it. And you're rightly pointing out that they're unpaid volunteers, and this is going to take up a lot of their time. So I question whether they're really going to have people willing to sit on these panels. So I just see there's something popped up in the Q&A as well. I'll just have a quick look. Someone's going to be in Liverpool. Hooray! Thank you. Good. Joining us. There's a question. How can a governor respond to a complaint if they have little or no knowledge of legal rights? I agree. They will have to have training. In fact, that is in the proposals that they will give training. But then again, that's imposing more obligations on governors. You've got to flog off to training on SEND so that you can sit on these complaints panels. And then people are going to think, oh, you know what, I can't be bothered. I can volunteer my services elsewhere where they don't impose all this onto me. And you contrast it now where you go to a panel which actually has a lawyer and has experts who are already people like educational psychologists who know about legal rights and who also know about the practicalities of SEND. You won't have that anymore, or not unless you're very lucky. So, they're not in a position. For what it's worth, years ago, just how long I've been doing things, before we had the tribunal, local authorities ran panels to deal with disputes about what were then statements of special educational needs. And as a pretty inexperienced school governor at that point, as before I started really doing very much in this field, I was on one of those panels, and I look back now and I'm ashamed, really, because we had no clue. All we could do really was do what the clerk told us. So effectively, it was sort of the clerk's decision, and it was hopeful. It was really poor, and the thought that we're going to go back to something that's even worse than that, I am not happy about. I'm exposing all my biases, and this is not necessarily meant to be something where I tell you what to write. By all means, ignore what I'm saying. But these things do worry me, and I would suggest they ought to worry the Department for Education. But as I say, generally, just to sum up, for this consultation, please don't be put off by the questions. Don't be intimidated by them. Feel free to say what you want to say, however you do it, whether you just do a great long answer to question 39, or you rewrite all the other questions for them and answer what you think they should have asked. And the ones you're not interested in, then, or you don't know about, then feel free to ignore them. But please do reply, because the more responses, the more they hear, the better it will, the final outcome will be. And we have seen in the past, I think these things can change minds. So any improvement will be a plus, I would suggest. So I'd like to thank you very much for registering. Remember, the deadline for these responses is May the 18th, and the protest on the 9th. See you there somewhere, perhaps. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.